Director.
I was born into a prominent family here in Boonville. My grandparents, Jacob and Nancy Shanks Wyan, owned and operated a store at the top of the cobblestone street that led down to the steamboat wharf on the Missouri River, and then on to Main Street at the top of the hill. Today, the Frederick Hotel sits on that parcel of land. My grandparents, in their elder years and in their wisdom, passed the store to my parents, James and Margaret Jane Wyan Russell Nelson. My parents had their hands full with the store and 5 children to raise. My half-brother, James Russell, was the oldest. My mother had been widowed when he was small. James, bless his heart, outlived us all. He died at the ripe old age of 92. I was born in 1862 during the Civil War. But you understand, I don't like to talk about my age. My brother Arthur, born in 1879, died at the age of 26. It was a great loss for our family. He is with us here in Walnut Grove. My other brother, Louis, grew up to be a banker in St. Louis. And finally, my only sister, Nadine, married into the Leonard family. They own a farm south of town known as Ravenswood. In my youth, I was an accomplished student, attending the Cooper Institute here in Boonville. My parents sent me to Mrs. Reed's Select School in New York City, where I finished my education. After returning home, I had many suitors. But then, Lawrence Lawn Vest Stevens came calling. Oh my. He was so handsome in those days. On October 5th, 1880, at the age of 18, I became his bride. We were married at the Methodist Episcopal Church on Spring Street here in town. It was a lovely service. I wish you all could have been there. I love children and young people so, but unfortunately, Lon and I were not blessed with children of our own. But you must know that we were both devoted to our nieces and nephews. And of course, not having children, I had time on my hands, and I was always willing to assist my husband in whatever endeavor he was involved with. including politics. But before we could start our political career, we had a terrible tragedy in our family.
That's right, Margaret. Sadly, my father, Joseph Stevens, died from an asthma attack in 1881. When the Fifth National Bank of St. Louis was declared insolvent in 1887, I was named receiver of the bank. And in 3 years, I recovered 98 cents on the dollar for the depositors. And then in 1890, Missouri Governor David Francis, for whom the Francis Quadrangle at the University of Missouri in Columbia is named, appointed me to fill the unexpired term of the Missouri State Treasurer, who had been convicted of embezzlement. By 1892, I had restored Missouri state finances and was elected to a full 4-year term. At the Missouri Democratic Party gubernatorial convention in 1896, I was nominated to run for governor. This was the first time that the Missouri Democrats had made a nomination by acclamation. Elected governor in November of 1896, I was sworn in on January 11th, 1897 as Missouri's 29th governor. You're probably thinking, 1897, Missouri had not been a state that long, 29 governors. How could that be? Well, as it turns out, in those days, and even up until 1965, Missouri governors were only allowed to serve 1 term. And before I became governor, even though Missouri had been a state for only 75 years, 16 of those former Missouri governors had only served terms of 2 years or less.
Well, as the governor's wife, I was known as a charming and stylish and graceful hostess who adored parties and entertaining. Oh my, we did have fun. Darling, you do know that we hold the record to this day for the most entertaining at the governor's mansion. As First Lady, I felt it was my duty to advocate for temperance and to be an upstanding member of the Methodist Episcopal Church. As a good Christian, I made numerous trips to the state prison to bring comfort and Christianity to the inmates. I also, excuse me, I also added a fountain and electric lighting to the governor's mansion.
And of course, in those days, electricity was not all that common, so having light was really wonderful and a lovely job she did.
Oh, thank you, dear.
Well, during my term as governor, there were a few accomplishments that I am rather proud of. I'd like to share with you. The Missouri voters authorized appropriation of funding for the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair. The Missouri State Penitentiary became self-sustaining. A 4th hospital for the insane was established in Farmington. In 1901, the first official Missouri State Fair was held at Sedalia. And I was very interested in that because I had heard that in Boonville for about 12 years approximately, the fair had been held until the Civil War disrupted and canceled the fair. As it turns out, during the Civil War, Union troops were housed in the fair livestock buildings. Well, that site is also the site where in the early 1800s, a fort had been built by Hannah Cole, the first white woman settler of Cooper County. Also on that site, the Second Battle of Boonville was fought during the Civil War. And then in 1911, the Benedictine Sisters of the St. Scholastica Monastery established the St. Joseph Hospital, which stayed and remained in operation until 1973. During my administration, the Missouri State Historical Society, which had been established by the Missouri Press Association in 1898, was named a trustee of the state in 1901. And finally, at the onset of the Spanish-American War in 1898, I refused to send Missouri National Guard troops to the conflict until the federal government agreed to provide them with uniforms and supplies. As it happens, the Missouri troops had inadequate clothing, and their weaponry and provisions were out of date. Although they arrived at the conflict late, 6 Missouri regiments served in Cuba.
Lon was always interested in history. He endowed the museum at Central College in Fayette, which is known today as Central Methodist University. The museum is named in Lon's honor. At the end of our one term as governor and first lady of Missouri, Lon and I moved to St. Louis. I became involved in fundraising to build a hospital, which today is Barnes Jewish Hospital. In those days, in those days, it began as a Methodist hospital.
And in private life in St. Louis, I continued to write editorials and articles for the Boonville Weekly Advertiser, while maintaining financial interest in banks across Missouri.
My beloved Lon died on January 10th, 1923. We buried him here in Walnut Grove. My heart was broken, and I grieved mightily. I wanted my husband to be remembered. So in 1925, I donated an organ to the Methodist Episcopal Church where we had been married. The organ cost $5,000. Now you understand, in those days, in the 1920s, a good house could be built for $3,000. I even hired an organist to come from New York City to play for the dedication. I also know that in the 1980s, the organ needed to be repaired or replaced. Upon learning that that a new organ of comparable quality would cost $500,000, the congregation raised $50,000 for the repairs. The dedication plaque on the organ still reads, "In memory of Governor Stevens." I'd say my choice of instruments was rather a good one, because it's still making beautiful music to this very day. Being a widow was very hard for me. I decided I needed a change. So I moved to St. Petersburg, Florida. It's warm there, you know. I have always adored being in the company of young people. And there I met a most wonderful young man, 40 years my junior, by the name of John Johnson. As things would happen, John and I were married in March of 1928. But just a little over a year later, on April 17th, 1929, I died. John insisted that I be brought home to this place of rest, and that I should be buried here, next to my first husband, Lon. He understood that the last name of Stevens should be my last name on the tombstone, because that is how the citizens of Missouri would remember me. I do believe John returned to Florida and married a lovely lady, 20 years his senior.
Probably poisoned her.
And I, Margaret Nelson Stevens Johnson, am so happy to be here with the love of my life, Governor Lawrence Lawn Vest Stevens. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you.
Now you know.
Yeah, I know.